Thank you for joining us on this update episode of LISK, Long Island Serial Killer. We haven't had an update in a while, and we've been waiting for more information, and we have other projects. And today we have a guest who has been with us for a long time, but she's moved on to other things. Shannon McGarvey is with us. Shannon, thank you for coming on and being with us today.
Thanks, Chris. Feels good to be back in the saddle, so to speak.
This latest update, the news that came out recently, was so big and involved so much information, new information, and has tied in two more victims, Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla, that we wanted to get on and kind of update in what we have learned and what we're finding out and what that means for other potential killers like John Bittroff. And, we've learned a lot about Rex's activities and his methods based on this bail document that we're going to talk about today. Basically, what this bail document is it brings these new charges and all this new information and re-ups the state's case for why he should not be let out on bail, which seems pretty straightforward. But I do want to say as we jump in that Rex Heuermann is the alleged killer. He has not been proven in a court of law, but we're talking about evidence that has been found at his house and DNA evidence and strong evidence, but he is still alleged until proven guilty.
Yeah, but, I'm no Heuermann apologist, and neither are you. But the evidence collected in this bail document is, from a layperson's perspective, like myself, as close as you can get to okay, lock him up, throw away the key, this is done. But yes, I think it is important to note that this is all alleged, but this evidence that we're going to go over today is pretty damning.
Yeah, and so, this bail document starts talking about, it names the other victims, the Gilgo Four, and it includes Maureen Brainerd Barnes this time as they were able to connect to him. And now it includes two new charges, murder in the second, for both Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla. And Sandra Castilla for some is kind of a new name, and we'll get into that. But Jessica Taylor has been tied to this case because of where her remains were found. But now we have evidence that ties it directly to Heuermann. So the first thing it starts off is, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about who the victims were and kind of where they were at when they went missing. And then what new information, what evidence that they reveal in this bail document that ties them to Heuermann. And so Shans, do you want to give a little background on who Jessica Taylor was and some of the details on what she was up to when she was last seen and when she disappeared?
Yeah. So for me personally, Jessica Taylor was always, all the victims in this case, when you have a picture and a name to go with them, and not just sort of vague details, it always hits a bit harder. And I remember when we first started working on this case back in 2016, Jessica Taylor's mugshot, the infamous mugshot of her, the one that is most sort of circulated, at least in the early stages of the case, is just so heartbreaking and sad. And to me, I've always seen that picture as sort of like an avatar for the horrors of sex work and coercion. I just go back to thinking about the things that we initially said about Jessica Taylor, that her family didn't want to talk and they weren't, that it was painful for them and they didn't want to come forward. And then now seeing the presser with her mother present and her cousin, this is very sad. And she was very, very much so loved. It reminds me actually of Melissa Bartholomew's story in that, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes as well, that they had a family that very, very, very much so loved them and missed them and had really nothing but kind words and fond memories upon reflecting on their childhoods and their upbringing. And it was very, very sad. And there were always so many questions, because her body, or at least some of her remains, were found in such close proximity to the Gilgo Four along Ocean Parkway on the same side of the road, within a mile. So there was always that question, and was she associated, and she's the same age, and like fit the same sort of MO. But unlike the Gilgo Four, we didn't really know a lot of information about her because her family, it's too painful, and like they never wanted to come forward. Well, the past few years, she has had family members come forward, and there have been social media accounts dedicated to her memory. There have been new pictures that have come out. There have been articles written about her. And we now know that she was very much so loved and a valued part of her family. She hailed from the Poughkeepsie area of New York, and she had fallen under the control of a pimp, and had wanted to leave and had left, and had since been staying in New York City with I think some random people she had met in fleeing Washington, D.C. to go to New York City. And the day that she disappeared in 2003, in July of 2003, she had actually called her mother and had planned a trip to go see her mother in Poughkeepsie. And that was the last time that her mom ever heard of her. And she reported her missing when Jessica never showed. And when you look at this bail document, they outline her last hours, that I think it was only a few hours after she had spoken to her mother that she presumably encountered Rex Heuermann and unfortunately met her end.
That's right. She had planned to go see her mom in Poughkeepsie, I think, for her mom's birthday, which shows her intent as far as the bail document of like what she was up to. And then a couple hours later, there was a call that came in. It was the last one that was known. And like you said, she didn't show up for her mom, and the mom called. And then that was July 21st. And then July 26th of 2003, a person's out walking their dog, and they come across this body. And what happens in this bail doc is they start tying things to Heuermann. So Rex worked near where Jessica Taylor had been doing sex work, and they tied him that he was in the city that day. I don't think they have calls necessarily tied to her yet that they've released. But then when they find her body on the 26th, SCPD is canvassing the area where Jessica Taylor was found, and they hear about a dark pickup the night before that was backed up into this area. And Rex heard about this somehow, and I guess it was probably through news reports, obviously. And he started researching, like getting a light pickup or changing his pickup, which, again, it's just a collection of evidence. So that doesn't prove anything, but it shows some intent there.
Yeah, I think that was really something that I have marveled at time and time again with all three of these bail documents, is just the detective work. And sure, you'll have people like, there was, I believe, a former prosecutor on Twitter who, piped up on my feed and said, it's actually not that airtight, and this detective work isn't that great. But to me, as someone who didn't know these details, to tie these things all together and to just see from an objective layperson's perspective all the things that go into sort of collecting evidence for an indictment is just really, really interesting. And I think in this document, as with the other documents, DNA evidence was critical. Yeah. Cell phone information was critical. But just as a side note, I do wonder, and I think probably a lot of other people have wondered as well. Despite the fact that I sit here and I marvel at the detective work in this bail document, I also wonder how much it informs like other potential serial killers and people, ne'er-do-wells, wanting to commit crimes, because it really goes and it's kind of like serves as a checklist. Okay, like don't use the internet, don't use your cell phone, don't, and it you'll get to this later, I'm sure, but this document actually dives into that, that Heuermann actually did research other serial killers, read Mindhunter, and was kind of course correcting based on
Mhm.
what he believed law enforcement might be looking for. And never underestimate the power that the future holds in terms of technology,
Yeah.
because I think that's what's amazing. And I'm sure that Heuermann could have never imagined at the time that DNA would be his downfall. He even he thought he was looking at hairs, and like, oh, I gotta
Yeah.
clean this, clean that, and then I deleted my web history, and I have burner phones, all of these things that were almost smart, but law enforcement is a step ahead, and technology is always a step ahead. So I think that's really interesting, and I hope deters any potential
Yeah.
ne'er-do-wells out there that trust you will get caught. If not now, then by technological advancement.
Yeah, that's a great point. We'll get into those details where, he had this whole document that he, as you mentioned, he thought he erased, but where he is listing what to do better and different things for prep and during and post. And when we get into that, you'll show like he was doing his best, but yeah, the future is hopefully going to catch more and more of this. And it's a deterrent, hopefully. But the kicker for Jessica was that they did find a hair under her body, and it was finally able to be tested. They did 2 labs, and just as recently as this year, and basically it comes back that it's a 99.9% chance that it's Heuermann.
When compared against the buccal swab that was taken from Heuermann earlier this year, and that again is like, wow, like how do you deny that? I mean, it's really hard. I mean, like you said, again, not to harp on the alleged thing, it's really hard to force that word out of my mouth, alleged, when considering what is laid out in this document. So
Well, and you could say, well, what if it were planted? But then it's like, so they have all this evidence that would have been planted, so it does start building up to this, beyond a reasonable doubt. But Shans, tell us a little bit about how the DNA has changed, and how it's gotten so specific and particular that it's really helped law enforcement.
Well, in short, to my limited understanding, when these hairs were initially collected, the limitations were such that up until only a few years ago, law enforcement was only able to analyze mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down on the maternal line. And it provides a great sketch of the person, but the details are very general. So what we had was, okay, we know that it's a male and we know that it's a Caucasian male, but beyond that, the details were a bit fuzzy. Now law enforcement can test nuclear DNA, which, if you imagine sort of your eyes being blurry and out of focus, that's the mitochondrial. You can kind of make out the shape and the size, but there's no real details. And nuclear DNA is kind of like your eyes focus in, and you suddenly have information from both the mother and the father, and you can really, kind of zoom in on the details. And it was because of this nuclear DNA that, when analyzed against Heuermann's buccal swab, they were able to confirm that it matched this hair found on the drop cloth underneath Jessica Taylor matched to the buccal swab taken from Heuermann. And I think it was like 99.6%. So pretty damn close match. And what does that match mean? I think it means that you're able to rule out 99.6% of the population, and like it's this other 0.4% is where Rex Heuermann falls. So it's not 100% exact, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, and I don't think they could ever say 100%, but you take that, 99.6 was pretty solid. And then, but you take that along with part of Heuermann's MO was that he would often, from what we've seen from the previous victims that have been tied to him, that, he does this when his family has traveled. And they were able to establish in this bail document, they talk about that they were able to establish his family traveled when she disappeared. His family had gone with some friends to a resort, Smuggler's Notch Resort in Jefferson, Vermont, and that they were able to tie calls from the home phone up there while they were gone to him checking in or whatever, and calls from his business up to Vermont to show that he had not gone with them and he was home. Again, that doesn't mean a ton other than you put it all together with the DNA, with the other evidence, it starts building this case.
And I think to your point, it's these things independent of each other are interesting. When looked at as a whole, they build a more sort of airtight indictment against him. And just a correction for something I said earlier, the mitochondrial DNA results, because I'm looking at the bail document right now, for Jessica Taylor, it was 99.96% of North American population can be excluded, but not Rex Heuermann. And then the nuclear, the S&P DNA results, it was 1.837 by 10 to the
bajillion.
Like 603rd exponent times more likely to come from an individual with an identical genetic profile as Rex Heuermann. So the statistical probability there is unbeatable, pretty much. It's without saying it, it's him. I mean, it's him or one of his relatives.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, I've always had this dream of spending my retirement on a catamaran cruising the Caribbean. So imagine basically achieving that only to have a deranged serial killer float up and board your boat. Well, that's pretty much the starting point of the new podcast, Natural Selection, Scott vs. Wild Bill. The new series from Treefort Media and Village Roadshow Entertainment is hosted by Candace DeLong, the creator of the podcast, Killer Psyche. Candace is a former FBI criminal profiler and uses her years of experience to unpack this bizarro story. I don't want to give too much away, but ultimately the podcast deals with the scary true story of a well-to-do American expat couple living in Panama who crossed paths with a shady dude called Wild Bill, who's part con artist and, unfortunately for the expats, also a murderer. Natural Selection has a ton of original interviews, including with old Wild Bill himself, who currently sits in a Panamanian jail. The podcast has moments of intrigue and shock and disbelief. It really is the kind of story that you need to hear from beginning to end. Natural Selection, Scott vs. Wild Bill, takes you deep into a story where truth really is stranger than fiction. Don't miss it. Find it on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Rex Heuermann is a demon that walks among us, a predator that ruined families.
The LISC, Long Island Serial Killer podcast, was shocked when the news broke of Rex Heuermann's arrest. After more than a decade of searching, law enforcement officials had finally pieced together enough evidence to bring formal charges against Rex Heuermann. Initially charged with 3 murders, Heuermann is now officially charged with all 4 deaths in the Gilgo 4 case. I'm your host, Chris Moss, and the LISC podcast will be releasing new episodes with interviews and fresh insight on the case as Rex Heuermann awaits trial in Long Island. While we are relieved by the arrest, the LISC podcast team will be working hard to share new developments and perspectives as we get them. So please keep your eyes and ears out for new episodes, and if you haven't already, please listen to seasons 1 and 2 of LISC, Long Island Serial Killer, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey there, I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and I have a confession to make. I am a true crime fanatic. I devour books and films, and most of all, true crime podcasts. But sometimes I just want to know more. I want to go deeper. And that's where my podcast, Crime Story, comes in. Every week, I go behind the scenes with the creators of the best in true crime. I chat with the host of Scamanda, Teacher's Pet, Bone Valley, the list goes on. For the insider scoop, find Crime Story in your podcast app.
And then, one of the things that we've heard recently is that they went back in the last couple of weeks into his house, into the Heuermann house, and extracted a bunch of stuff, including 350 devices or electronics, basically, which, it was everything from hard drives to thumb drives to one thing was on a hard drive they had some old files of a Palm Pilot calendar dates that noted wife in Vermont at Smuggler's Resort. So just this burden of proof that they're putting together that says his family was gone, he was home, there's DNA, there's, evidence that he was around where she worked doing sex work in the city. So they were able to put this all together, and they feel strongly that they're, it's the guy, and they were able to charge him for it.
And I think that's another thing to note that is interesting is that, we talk a lot about MOs, signatures, patterns, and stuff like that. And I think something that this bail document really highlighted for me was that, and we can get into this a little bit later, but MOs change, they can change. Patterns typically remain consistent. And one of the patterns that emerged from reading this is that these atrocities always or almost always occurred when the Heuermann significant other was out of the picture. So in recent years, when his wife was vacationing either in Iceland or Smuggler's Notch or some other undisclosed location, and in the case of Sandra Castilla, a previous significant other, presumably, I believe she was called Witness 3, but she was out of the picture. She was not present. So I think that is just an interesting pattern to note, because in discussing this and, just kind of zooming out from this document and, our big takeaways, I mean, for me, I think that, you have, and we'll get into this with Sandra Castillo, but, the timeline, everything we thought we knew about the Long Island serial killer timeline has just been blown apart. And then that opens this case up to an almost sort of exponential amount of possibilities, victims, all of these contingencies. And so it can be very disorienting. But I think what's interesting is that there still was a pattern. And even, and that is consistent with, at least according to the FBI, every single serial killer.
Yeah.
Even if the MO changes, even if the signature is different, the pattern is always kind of the same.
Yeah, and that's a good lead into the next part of the bail document, which is the discovery of human remains of Sandra Castilla. And like Shan says, that takes our timeline back at least 10 years.
prior to Jessica Taylor. Yeah.
Jessica Taylor was 2003. But so Castilla, so on November 20th, 1993, two people were out hunting in a wooded area in Southampton, which is kind of as far east as this case has gone, out on Long Island. And they've discovered these remains. She'd been 28 at the time. She was lying on her back with her arms outstretched over her head. And I don't want to go into too many details.
Yeah, please don't.
But no, and there are some disturbing injuries that she was subjected to. But so they find this body, and then what happened, according to bail doc, is that forensics found under the right arm, they find a hair that was not Castilla's, so it's a female hair. And then there's a male hair and another unidentified female hair. So they've collected these. And as Shan's talked about before, the DNA and the forensics wasn't quite up to speed to really narrow in on some of that. And even if they did, they probably didn't know what they were looking at and who they were looking for, with a database that they didn't really have at the time. But in 2014, well before Heuermann came on the scene, the hairs were sent to a laboratory to test against John Bittroff. Now, if you don't know John Bittroff, why don't you tell us a little bit about Bittroff and how he is connected to all of this?
Bittroff is a man who was convicted in, I believe, 2017 for the murder of Colleen McNamee and Rita Tangredi.
One was 94 because they were right around. That's one thing that is important because one was within weeks of Castilla and one was 2 months. So I think January of 94.
I remember one. I seem to remember one, and I'm just going by memory here. I seem to remember one being in November and one being in January. They both happened in winter, but one happened before the turn of the new year and the other happened right after the turn of the new year. And she was never directly affiliated, or linked to John Bittroff. But if you look at early articles about Bittroff and, the ones that mention Colleen McNamee and Rita Tangredi, Sandra Castilla is always or almost always mentioned as a third possible victim of Bittroff. So to hear that Sandra Castilla was no longer attributed or associated to John Bittroff and now linked to Rex Heuermann was not only watershed. It wasn't only a watershed moment in the case, but it was really a groundbreaking moment in the case for anyone who has been following this case as we have. So she, and I didn't really know much about Sandra Castilla aside from what news articles had really told us over the years, but she was a resident of Trinidad and Tobago. She was living in New York City. She was young, living in Queens, and we now know somehow encountered Rex Heuermann in 1993. And again, like all of the other victims, met her end in unthinkable ways. So, but I think what's interesting about this is that not only, like I said before, does this bust the timeline of the Long Island serial killer case or, Gilgo Beach murders case open and expand it by over 20 years or almost 20 years, it also casts a shadow of doubt on the validity of John Bittroff's conviction, which has long been contested by the Bittroff family. There have long since been rumors that John Bittroff was railroaded that the DNA evidence was botched. It was sort of made to fit to get him in, and if you look back at news articles from 2017, 2018, you'll see people like former Suffolk County prosecutor Robert Biancavilla, who comes forward and suggests that even John Bitroff might be the Long Island serial killer. So I'm not I'm not pretending to know or be an expert on the Bitroff case and the DNA evidence around Colleen McNamee and Rita Tangredi. But I think given the fact that early news articles claim that Sandra Castillo's body was found in similar ways, that, Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee's body were also found in similar ways, that they were found in similar conditions. They were all found along the South Shore, which is consistent with Rex Heuermann's pattern of disposal. I think it's enough for me as a layperson to want to re-examine the validity of that DNA and like how, just kind of reopen the Bitroff case. I know that he's been working on an appeal for some time. And Chris actually spoke to the Bitroff family, and actually John Bitroff was on the phone back in, it was 2017. It was before his
2017 or 2018. Yeah.
It was before his conviction because you were out on Long Island. It was early 2017. And he was, I believe he was convicted in like the summer.
Yeah, he was in jail at the time. And those are good questions. And, we'll talk about Bitroff. And that's why they tested this because, Castillo was found within weeks or months of the other two Bitroff victims and kind of placed the same way that Tangredi and McNamee were placed, but they could not tie him to DNA. So he was kind of ruled out. We just, like Shannon mentioned, we thought, it's just a matter of time probably before they find enough evidence to tie that one to him. And it never happened. And we were like, well, that's interesting. But like Shannon says, it does start bringing up this question of what's going on with Bitroff.
Once they had felt like they sort of nabbed someone for Colleen McNamee and Rita Tangredi, they were eyeing him to kind of make Sandra Castillo fit into into his victims as well.
But then what happens is they revisit these cases like Castillo, and they test it in the last year or two, this DNA, and they're like, wow, we tested against heuermann and we've got a match. And so what they also did, so there's the DNA, which is very strong, but as we said, it's kind of this collection of evidence, this burden of evidence. And the task force talked to a witness. Witness number 3 is what they call her in the bail document, who'd been living with Rex. This woman had been living with heuermann, and it was her hair that was found on Castillo. But that woman had moved out 2 months before Castillo went missing. So obviously, hairs hang around. And so they don't think she is tied to heuermann and this killing, but it shows that, again, his MO is once I'm free of people, family, significant others, I do this. Now, was he doing it before? That becomes the big question. Was he doing it within weeks of this? And could he be tied to Tangredi or McNamee? That's one of those questions that come up. But before we go into that and how it raises questions, I think the bail document then goes into some really interesting stuff, which is this digital evidence.
Oh, God.
350 electronic devices, which I talked to my dad, who's really sweet. He always updates me on stuff he reads about Lisk. And he's like, where did he keep it all? I'm like, well, some were thumb drives, some were hard drives. It wasn't all just big old computers. But they start going through this stuff and analyzing it. As you said, they have these forensic
Analysts.
yeah, these electronic forensic people who go through this stuff, and they were able to find this document. And it's called the HK 2002, 2004, basically document. And, Heuermann is not giving them the info on this, so they're having to extract some what they think. But when you go through this, they think the HK stands for Heuermann's kills between 2002, 2004, and it basically is a chilling picture of what he is doing. And he thought, again, as Shan's mentioned, he thought he erased this. And, but they talk about how things are stored, how documents are stored even after you erase them. It's
just sick.
It's really disturbing. I would not suggest go reading it. We're not going to cover a lot of the details because they're so disturbing. But these devices reveal that Heuermann was into some serious, disturbing porn, violent bondage, torture, and that dated back to 94. And maybe
it was what we called snuff films, right? And snuff porn. And these are things that before we had Heuermann's name, we always speculated about this. And there was a lot of speculation around, and this is one of the things that sort of put James Burke, his name, into the mix. But yeah, this account of, the document, which is, copied and pasted into the bail application, is just so chilling and disturbing. I probably making people want to go read it now. But just steel yourself if you haven't read it already. Heuermann basically project manages his these murders and forecasts any potential pitfalls, problems, supplies needed, dump sites, possible victims. It's very methodical, and very calculated. And I think I've wondered, just given what he did for a living, if he wasn't kind of transferring some of those skills and applying them to murder, honestly.
Yeah.
As an architect and, sort of project managing these projects and, all of that. I mean, it just seems, these are the things, me as a producer, when I'm, in pre-production, when I'm planning a project, even, any project you're going to manage, you take certain steps. And looking at this, I can't help but think like, oh man, like he was really looking at this as like a job or as like a sick, like something that, I don't know, like it was just weird to think that there are people out there who would be this meticulous and try to think through every contingency and every possible problem and try to avoid apprehension. And
in some of the, this document, some of the stuff I don't mind talking about that's not as disturbing, but he has these 4 columns: problems, supplies, DS, which it doesn't say dump site, but that's kind of what they think. It doesn't specifically say that, but it kind of, it all but says that. And then the TRG, I think, is the right girl. So problems, DNA, tire marks. He writes this stuff out: blood stains, fingerprints, foot shoe prints, photos, misleaders, police stop, truck stuck. Like, what things could you run into? Plastic bags matched a box, hair, fiber.
And even recon. I mean, we know he was a hunter, so he's not only applying skills that he would have used as an architect, but also applying, the sort of primitive skills of a hunter. And
Was he a hunter?
he was a hunter. He was very, very much so a hunter, and
In
very
South Carolina, I guess, or whatever. Or
no,
I
he
know
would go. He was
Mitroff did, but
yeah,
I didn't know who did.
So Heuermann was part of a gun club in the Manorville area, and was very much so a hunter and very interested in guns, and would offer to take acquaintances, friends, whatever. I don't know if he actually had friends.
No.
He did have some friends, but he would go hunting with these people.
Imagine unlocking a version of yourself that's unstoppable, where mental barriers no longer hold you back. Listen to Mentally Stronger with me, Amy Morin, therapist and international best-selling author, here to guide you on a journey to reaching your greatest potential. Every Monday, I bring you into conversations with some of the most fascinating minds. Experts, authors, entrepreneurs, athletes, and musicians. They don't just share stories, they reveal the mental strategies that propelled them to the top. But here's the real magic. At the end of each episode, I break down their wisdom into practical therapist-approved advice. In my solo episodes, I dive deep into the techniques that build mental strength. It's like having your own personal therapy session as you discover how to turn these insights into steps you can take right now. This podcast isn't just for those facing mental health challenges. It's for anyone who wants to push their limits, achieve peak performance, and truly thrive. Are you ready to unlock your full potential? Then it's time to become mentally stronger. Subscribe to Mentally Stronger with therapist Amy Morin, available wherever you love to listen to podcasts.
Hi, I'm Karina Beamisturfer, host of Morning Cup of Murder, your daily true crime podcast. Yes, you heard me right, daily true crime. Every day, Morning Cup of Murder tells you a straightforward, short-form story about murder, true crime, cold cases, disappearances, serial killers, cults, and more. And I do that all in under 15 minutes. With over 3 years of stories and over 20 million downloads, the Morning Cup of Murder podcast has become a staple of so many people's daily routines. So, why not add it to yours? Stream Morning Cup of Murder everywhere you listen to podcasts, and remember, stay safe.
Do you need a true crime fix? The show shines a spotlight on the darker things in life, covering real murders, mysteries, missing persons, and more. Each week, I'll take you on a deep dive into the darker side of history, mystery, and murder. Be warned, Obscura is not for the squeamish. Shocking crimes are covered in full detail, and real court and 911 audio is used when possible. If you're a true crime fan with a taste for the hard stuff, then Obscura has you covered. Each month sees the release of Obscura Black Label. Black Label is reserved for only the darkest cases. Finally, if you're a listener that likes a binge, Obscura has a large library of episodes ready for you to download now. You can find Obscura, a true crime podcast, on your podcast app of choice. Just search Obscura True Crime, and you can't miss our logo.
It's really chilling to think that, the skills that he had from hunting, from being an architect, that he would sort of transpose or overlay these skills onto killing someone is just beyond comprehension to, I think, a lot of people, including myself. And that might be surprising because we've been so embedded with this case for so long, but we've never seen this, laid out as such ever.
Well, and it's one of those things where we all have a ton of documents. Well, a lot of us have tons of documents on our computer, but this one really spells out some stuff like supplies. It'd be hard to kind of spin this in a different way. Like, oh, it's for a house we're building in Southampton. Like booties, lye, acid, police scanner, rope, cord, saw, cutting tools, body wash, wipes, tarps, drop cloths. Those are the supplies. And then he talks about dump sites and then how to recon next time. Next time's important because it shows like he's already done it, and next time do some more recon on this. And then in the TRG, which we believe it means the right girl, he mentions small is good. So
That's
he's thinking through
very disturbing.
through victims. And so that was found, and then it gets into
Well, and then you go down the document and it gets it's even more produced, because then it's like prep, post-event. And, it's interesting because in the podcast and video production world, there are 3 stages. There's pre-production, production, and post-production. So again, he's like really applying these kind of, methodologies to murder, which is just so chilling. And he accounts for, in the pre-prep, there's vehicle inspections, there's recon,
which is like don't make sure your car's up to date so you don't get stopped, because he's learned that. Like, I think that's how Robert
Schulman got pulled over. The serial killer who was apprehended, and the other Long Island serial killer was apprehended in 1996. He was pulled over, and then also Joel Rifkin.
Rifkin's plates were out, I think. So it's like, he's learning like vehicle inspection. Go ahead. You were talking about some of those.
Yeah. And then weather report, recon video cameras or CCTV. And then in terms of the prep,
this is disturbing.
This is really disturbing. And I don't really feel comfortable in getting into like all the gory details, but he describes supplies needed for some sort of like holding torture device. And then the post event, he says destroy files, change tires, burn gloves, dispose of pics, have your story set. I mean, like that's if that's not damning, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what is.
And the prep thing, it is disturbing. And we had heard there had been talk of torture. And sadly, it looks like that happened, which is just horrific. And I don't want to go into any more of that, but it shows that what was suspected, if this is evidence, it shows that he was part of that. So yeah, this document, which goes on, it goes on and it talks about like, remember, don't charge gas because they'll have a receipt to tie you to. So he is learning, he is adapting, he's planning, he's reading books. It goes into body prep, which is disturbing. And then what to dispose of the tools, drop cloths, wipes. Why do you change tires? Which you mentioned before, Shans, is because they'll check tire patterns. And he's like, he talked about changing trucks. He talked about changing tires so they can't tie him to that.
More sleep and noise control, more time to play. I mean, like that was something like things to remember for next time, even just making a note to himself, like get more sleep. It's just sick. Honestly, I'm going to tell you, after I read through the details of this, I was so disturbed. And I know that a lot of other people in the community have been following this case and reading these details. I mean, it was just so sick. And the level of depravity, it's unimaginable that any human being could commit these atrocities against another living thing, be it an animal or another human being. And it's just, and maybe that's why people are drawn to these cases, that it's unimaginable. But I personally, I take no pleasure in any of this. And it's incredibly disturbing, and I had nightmares. Honestly, I mean, it's you wake up thinking about it. I don't know how any normal functioning human being could look at these details and look at the women that they were, committed against and not be just deeply disturbed and changed fundamentally.
Yeah, and it is so disturbing. And so I would suggest you don't go read it if you're listening. We're covering enough that just shows the evidence that ties it to Heuermann. And that's what we don't want to share too much. But one thing I will say with body prep that he mentions is remove head and hands. So it's something like because Castilla, who they've tied to him, she was not dismembered. And so it's something like he's grown in this time, in the 10 years, he's changed and adapted to say, like, maybe this will help if I remove head and hands. And then that's what happened to Jessica Taylor in 2003 and beyond, where those parts would end up on Ocean Parkway. And then, he talks about removing ID marks, tattoos. We know that happened with Jessica Taylor. She had a tattoo that was dismembered. I will say it like that. And then he also talks about, well, I don't even think I want to mention, like, hit harder, too many hits to take down. So when he attacked, he was like, I've got to, I can't pull my punches, basically. I've got to really hit harder so there's less fight, which is just disturbing.
And when you think of the fact that this guy was like upwards of 6'4", and these women, some of them were 4'10", it's just sick. Like, this person is a coward. I mean, it's just absolutely disgusting. These women were, some of them were like childlike. I mean, they were very young, yes, but their bodies were incredibly small.
Yeah.
And there was no way. They didn't stand a chance. There was no way. And yeah, this person is disgusting. And honestly, I have no problem saying I hope he rots in jail and gets what's coming to him, honestly. Because the details laid out in this document are just beyond what I ever imagined would come out.
Yeah.
And the fact that he, there's a picture of the cover of a John Douglas book, and Douglas was the name I couldn't think of earlier. It had mentioned, I believe, in a previous bail document that he had read Mindhunter, John Douglas's other book, and the cover of the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, was also found at his residence. So he really was, it seems, studying and fascinated by other serial killer cases and learning from them as to not presumably suffer the same pitfalls. So, and that's just sick too, because you think, like, wow, there's people like John Douglas have inadvertently published handbooks to, guide serial killers. And that's what I was fearing about these bail documents, that other potential serial killers, ne'er-do-wells, whatever, would use these documents like Rex Heuermann had used Mindhunter and The Cases That Haunt Us to learn from and sort of get smarter than law enforcement.
Yeah, and he definitely was studying, on this document. There's a notes section which talks about spur of the moment. The more you do, the more clues you give. Look at the painting, which is a reference to the artist in the Mindhunter, which is, the killer, like, disorganized versus organized. And then he pulls out certain pages, which are really disturbing. So again, we only bring this up to point out the evidence in which they're able to point to say this guy, we believe, is the guy, and he is disturbing and he needs to go away for a long time. So yeah, when you put that totality together, and they spell it out at the end of this section where they're like, you look at all this homework, they call it in this bail document, his concerns regarding avoiding being captured on video, leaving behind forensic evidence, what supplies to purchase, how to package a body for transportation to dump sites, how to wash the body, avoid a paper trail, like don't charge for gas, concerning noise or air travel, which inhibits this time he has, or how to improve next time. It's like this. You put this together and you can see that this guy is disturbed and a monster. And that's why he should be, held without bail and hopefully, like Shannon said, for the rest of his life for these alleged crimes.
I think that given what we know now about the timeline and the exponential possibility, I think that we're going to see a lot more of these sort of like groundbreaking, earth-shattering revelations that challenge commonly held beliefs about this case. And I think that the work of these investigators, which I cannot commend enough, has really only just begun. And I hope that if eventually a conviction is reached and appeals have been exhausted, because I doubt that he would just roll over and take it, I hope eventually that some confessions will come forward.
Well, I was going to say, I hope that they're cut short by him confessing. I mean, if he's listening, I know he listened, that's one thing. He listened to podcasts, he kept up with things, but that he would save the time for the investigators and for the families and come forward and admit to what he's done. It's unlikely.
That'll never happen. I think that,
but it would be nice.
It would be nice. And,
yeah.
and I look at least from outward appearances, Asa, his wife, seems to be standing by his side, seems by outward appearances to be supporting him, which only leads to the assumption that she believes he is innocent. I don't know that, if he has that support, that unwavering, illogical, irrational support, I don't know that he would admit to doing any of this, because that's his lifeline. That's his lifeline to the outside world. Everyone else thinks he's a monster, but Asa and maybe his daughter and his stepson, are, and who knows, his mother perhaps, are the people that are standing by him. And I don't know, I think that I would imagine that to someone like him, who is a total demon who walks amongst us, to quote Rodney Harrison, I think, to him that means everything. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I hope he confesses, but I don't know that he ever would.
Well, and if the family happens to be listening, I'll just say it. I hope they look at this evidence and really have a come to Jesus moment. And because if that is what's keeping him from confessing, I doubt it's that, because he knows he's a monster, I believe. I know it's alleged, but I think he knows what he's done.
I think this document has shown that commonly held beliefs about this case are inaccurate.
Well, Shan, thank you for joining us. And
thank you. I've as always, I enjoy talking shop.
And we kept it to relevant stuff, which is, hey, this is important because it shows that it ties it to him, which is why we talk about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this update episode of Lisk, Long Island serial killer, and a special thanks to